Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
For centuries, the pipe organ has been the foundation of the music of worship in churches large and small. From the magnificent grand cathedrals of Europe to small towns and villages in the U.S., congregational singing has been supported and enriched by pipe organs, the so-called king of the instruments. To be sure, pipe organs are no longer trending. Electronic keyboards, many trying to sound like pipe organs, and praise bands, and some holdovers from the 1960s, those guitar masses, they've supplanted organ music in many worshiping communities. But where more traditional church music reigns, the pipe organ still resounds with praise, powerful and profound. And yeah, sometimes maybe just a little bit pompous. Don't tell my wife I said that. She's a retired church organist and choir director. When my wife studied organ at the Conservatory of Music at Westminster College in Pennsylvania, the instrument was still in its glory days. And teenagers who grew up taking piano lessons and going to church regularly may have been fascinated and awestruck even by the complexity of multiple keyboards, foot pedals, stops, wind chambers, and pipes that ranged from thin pencil shapes to big 16-foot or longer pipes. And the sound they made. But today, not only have musical tastes changed, but pipe organs are expensive to purchase, to maintain, and to repair. And even if the instrument is in stellar working condition, trying to find someone to play the instrument is becoming a challenge. When my wife and I toured a large church in Nova Scotia a few years ago, the priest put it this way: "We have $1 million organ in this church, but only a $10 organist." On today's program, I invite you to encounter a young organ student from Owego and also meet his teacher, a longtime member of the AGO, the American Guild of Organists. We'll talk about what attracted a teenager to his church's pipe organ and how things are going for him as he learns the instrument. Jordan Dove is a student at SUNY-Fredonia. The pipe organ of all instruments.
My grandfather was an organist for over 50 years at his church. So whenever I went over to visit him, I would always watch him, and after the service I would go up and check it out.
Yeah, and by check it out, you mean sit there and play a little bit?
Play a little bit and watch him play, and was just fascinated by everything going on.
So your grandfather certainly knows the pipe organ, but is this the same grandfather who has taught you and your siblings other instruments?
Yes. He started us all on violin when we were all three. So
must have been an interesting screech heard around the world, at least in your neighborhood. And you play other instruments besides the organ?
Yes. I play piano, violin, trombone, cello, and then organ.
Yeah. So the musical genes are pretty strong. And you are now at Fredonia?
Yes.
Majoring?
In music education and trombone performance.
Jackson is Jordan Dove's teacher and an organist at Christ the King Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Spencer. Been Jordan's teacher for how long?
I'm not sure. 5 years, maybe? I think 5 years. He'd already started piano, and so I picked him up with piano, and then he at some point expressed interest in switching to the organ. Right. And when we first started, of course, we were coming to the cold church for lessons, so it was kind of depended on the weather, how cold it was, whether there'd be an organ lesson or a piano lesson.
Right, right. At this church?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember being Jordan's age and what music lessons felt like back then?
I don't remember being Jordan's age, but I do remember my beginning lessons. I started out with piano, and my piano teacher was actually a violin teacher, so she was very strict, which was probably a good thing. But then at some point, I believe it was my sophomore year in high school, the church that I went to, a person had donated a brand new organ, and with it came lessons. So I got drafted for the lessons.
Right. And when you say drafted, this is the passive voice, which means this was not your first desire to do?
Oh, no, that's not true, but it was just that I was the one that played the piano, so therefore. And I loved it. I really loved it.
And so you've played in churches for quite a while. That's pretty much where people play pipe organs.
Churches, concert halls, yes, pretty much that's it.
Yeah. They don't do that in movie theaters much anymore.
No, really. There are some theater organs still around, but few and far between. And there are a few outdoor organs, for example, the one in San Diego, for outdoor entertainment, but pretty rare.
It may have been San Diego. I remember going someplace where there was a big old pipe organ that had been taken out of a theater. And so it was called Pizza and Pipes. So you go in and order a pizza, and then the organ would play, or someone would play it. And I thought, gosh, what a come down for this instrument. This is called the king of the instruments. Why is that?
I think because it first of all has such an impact as far as volume, what you can play on it, what you can do with it. And of course, depending on the instrument, a really grand, huge pipe organ is extremely impressive.
Is that what attracted you to it, besides your grandfather's playing it in church? There was some curiosity involved there, but what happened when you started making music on it?
Yes, definitely the volume and the different sounds you can make, and just everything that it's so challenging to play, and that intrigued me too.
What's the most challenging thing?
Probably both hands on different manuals, and then with the pedals as well.
So you're using both hands, you're playing the pedals, and then some organists in church sing along too, to get the phrasing right on the hymns that they're playing for. And you're playing now with, well, let's see, 5 years worth of lessons, and now and then you're playing in churches.
Yes. I've played church services for about 2 years, I would say, on and off. So.
And what's it like to be one of the worship leaders?
Well, it's kind of, I'm used to watching it from out in the pews, and now it's like I get to lead, and I don't know, it's kind of cool.
Yeah. The American Guild of Organists, the AGO, is kind of the, I guess, it's fellowship, a support group, it's a professional organization, and you've been a part of that for some time.
Many years, actually, since I was an organ student.
Yeah.
They have a student chapter initially, and then after a certain age, you're an adult member of AGO.
Yeah. And through the years that you've been playing, what's the state of the pipe organ these days?
Well, it varies. It varies very much regionally. A lot of churches have been unable to find organists because there's a real organist shortage. And so they've gone to other alternatives for leading worship, some better, some worse. In some areas of the country, there are still huge music programs with huge instruments and that sort of.
Right.
But it's becoming less and less, unfortunately. And part of the problem is, like I said before, the shortage of organists, and also the shortage of people that want to play in church. There are still organists out there, but they're not really willing to do that weekly commitment of playing church services.
And there's a general decline in church membership, and as the pipe organs age, the upkeep of the pipe organ becomes quite an expense.
It can be. This instrument behind us has been around for a long time, and because of the fact that it's mechanical action, it's pretty maintenance-free. Your yearly or bi-yearly tuning is about all the maintenance it needs. But some instruments, it gets to be very costly trying to maintain a pipe organ. And certainly if you're to buy one brand new, it's just unbelievably expensive.
And as you've moved from one church to another, you've played on, is this the biggest one you've played on, or have you played on larger instruments?
The organ at SUNY-Fredonia has 3 manuals and a pedal board, and that's, I believe there's 32 foot pedals.
Yeah.
So
that's a 32-foot pipe,
yes.
which is considerable. It's taller than I am. When you have played some of the smaller organs, do you feel limited?
There's different variety. You obviously have to play to the strengths of the organ. So use the different stops to your advantage. And
one of the things about an organ that I think attracted people to it early on, and that led it into, of all things, radio programs. Back in the 30s and 40s, radio stations had an organ, and they used it to accompany drama and comedy and so on. I suppose it's because the organ can make all these different sounds. So without putting you too much on the spot, what are the musical instruments that an organ can sound like?
well, there's flutes, there's an oboe, there's trumpets, there's trombone, there's strings, so violin, cello, viola, and then there's bass, pretty much every instrument.
Did he miss anything?
Not really.
How about bells?
Depends on the instrument. This instrument here doesn't, but for example, theater organs have all sorts of bells and whistles, chimes and vibraharp, and sometimes even a piano attached to them. So
the organ, because it is an expensive thing to build and to maintain, is giving way in a lot of churches to other instruments, guitars, drums, and that kind of thing, but also just a keyboard that can sound like an organ. Do you begin to feel like kind of a dinosaur when churches are built and a pipe organ isn't even considered? And I'm not calling you a dinosaur. I guess it's the instrument that's the dinosaur.
I do feel somewhat like a dinosaur, though. It seems to be a dying era, and yet it's not. It just looks that way sometimes. Part of the problem, I think, is that there's not been enough recruiting done for younger people to play the organ. So all of us oldies are waiting to pass the baton, but there's no one out there to take it. So.
And I guess if you look at the AGO, it's a graying organization to some extent, but not totally. Sometimes I think of church and jazz as being the same generations. I go to jazz concerts and see people with no hair or gray hair. What do your friends think about you being a pipe organ player?
Well, I gave a speech actually in public speaking last year, and they were all fascinated, and they were right on the edge of their seats, just very interested in finding out what it's like.
When you played your recital here in this church in Owego last summer, you showed some of your classmates, I guess, the organ. What questions did they have?
Mainly just how you do it, how you multitask with the different, doing everything at once.
And so that's one of the things that makes the organ different from your other instruments, I suppose. The slide has, 7 positions? And an organ can have, any number of keys depending on the number of keyboards, ranks.
Yes, to both of those. Many ranks and many keyboards. So.
And when you sit down to look at music for the first time, it must be quite a challenge to look at that page and realize you have to translate those notes into music.
Yes, and then you also have to think about how your hands, how big they are, and then because different hymns aren't necessarily written to be played on the organ. They're written for choirs to sing. So then you have to figure out different hands to, if your left hand has to help out your right hand, if the notes are too far apart.
And a lot of contemporary church music isn't even written with the organ in mind.
No, definitely not. Although it's not impossible to play on the organ. I think some organists give up and say, oh, I can't do this, but quite often music can be adapted to the organ.
Yeah.
It depends on what sort of sound you want. I think with a lot of contemporary music, they don't want that particular sound.
Yeah.
It's not that it can't be played on there, but...
And adaptation is certainly something, as any musician looks at the printed page, you leave out a few notes if you can't play them all, but you still have to make it sound nice. How much leeway do you have when you look at a piece of music and sit down at the keyboard?
Well, the most important is obviously the melody, and then melody and bass. So those are the two main important, and then everything else you try your best to fill in.
Do you still practice every day, Dave?
Not every day, but I still practice. Yeah, it's very easy to get out of practice. I mean, not that you can't play, but the tough stuff needs practice all the time.
This week on Encounter, we're talking with David Jackson, the organist at Christ the King Fellowship Presbyterian Church in Spencer, and his organ student, 20-year-old Jordan Dove, a student at SUNY-Fredonia.
I wanted to jump on what you were just saying, too. Traditionally for organists, especially in church where you're accompanying choirs and soloists and so forth, you very often get a piano score or sometimes even an orchestra score that you have to reduce for the organ. So that's one of the challenges and requirements for organists, really, to be able to do. And like Jordan says, you get